On one of my previous videos, one of my viewers asked me if I could make a reaction to this. It's called Canadian Veterans Celebrated in the Netherlands. And this is for VE Day. So of course one of the other things I mentioned is I'm very interested to find out more about the Canadian military. That's just a topic I'm generally interested in from most countries. I have family in the British military, so it's just something that hits home to me, is close to my family. And yeah, really interested to know this. It's quite an interesting relationship, Canada and the Netherlands. It's not something I knew was a close relationship, but very happy to find out more, excited to find out more. So let's check this out and yeah, we can see how it goes.
The Netherlands in the spring. Beautiful. Flowers in full bloom, parks pristine, streets spotless. It's a far cry from what the same spots were like 70 years ago. The Germans had leveled the cities, murdered those who got in the way, and sent tens of thousands of Jews to be gassed in death camps. The Dutch who were left were starving after the 5 years of brutal Nazi occupation. By 1945, they were so hungry, some were eating tulip bulbs to stay alive.
The starved and rickety-ridden bodies of this Dutch family are witnesses to the treatment the Germans meted out to our friends in Holland.
That's when the Canadians arrived, blasting their way into towns like this one, Apeldoorn, crushing the Nazis, liberating the people.
This is again what I mentioned on one of my previous videos. I'm really interested to know more about Canada's role in the world wars, and also as an ally. I'm from the UK, obviously, just as an ally to the UK and how we've, as countries, have fought alongside each other. Someone told me an interesting thing on one of my other videos, that Canada's never actually lost a war. It's an unbelievable fact, something I really appreciate. And again, I'm really interested to see Canada's role in the World War. It looks like they came in and really helped out so far. Let's just see.
The Dutch have never forgotten, never. And this week, they'll be in these streets again, by the thousands, to welcome back some of those Canadians, now in their 90s, who gave them their country, their lives back.
Okay, this I definitely never knew. That's unbelievable for them still to pay respect in such a way is fantastic. It's great respect from the Dutch to be able to parade these heroes in front of the people. For these soldiers, man, I imagine the heroism of these people during those times. All these years later, to actually feel that thanks, and you know, without Canadians in that situation, the world could have been a very different place. Netherlands could be a very different place.
I've been coming here for 20 years, never ceasing to be amazed at the Dutch determination to say thank you.
This street with its pennants and Canadian flags is representative of many streets across the Netherlands right now, as the Dutch mark the major contribution that Canada played in the liberation of their country half a century ago.
I'm very young. I only heard stories from my grandfather and grandmother. But yes, they freed us 50 years ago, so that's why I'm here.
I think it's a love affair between the Canadians and the Dutch.
A love affair. Wow. To see people, that's Dutch people of different ages, older people and younger people, but the good thing to see is these younger people are still being educated by their family members, maybe in other areas as well, to actually have that respect, to see it's actually being passed through the generations, and they still have that respect and that gratitude for the Canadians. I love that. Tell me what you feel, how you feel about, if you're from Canada, how you actually feel about this relationship.
Years is an awfully long time, but not long enough for the Dutch to forget the pain, the loss, the suffering, and the oppression of living under Nazi rule all those years during the Second World War. and not long enough either to forget the liberation and those who brought it to them.
It's a beautiful day. This is out of this world.
I'm feeling liberated.
This actually warms my heart.
107,000 people left this place on the...
How much?
107,000 people left this place on the trains destined for the death camps of Nazi-occupied Europe. 102,000 of them perished in...
What? It's just that when you hear about the numbers from the World War, from the World War II, the people who died, it's horrific, the numbers.
Those camps. On days like this, the Dutch come to remember what happened here more than 65 years ago.
The camp life was dominated by the train. The train was taking away 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 prisoners, and you prayed being not on the list.
Why do they never forget? Just listen to some of the stories we've heard over the years.
And I said, do you eat that every day? Sure. You want some? I'll give you a whole loaf. A whole loaf of white bread. I ran to the house and I planted it on the breakfast table and I said, here, look at it. Canadians are here.
Can you imagine like the feeling, how seeing their fellow neighbours being transported off to their death, how fearful they must have been? To actually have the opposite feeling when the Canadians rolled into town, it must have been like, you really can't explain those feelings. Like, luckily for soldiers like these Canadians, they've given people like us our freedom. These brave soldiers back in the World War II, they fought for our freedom so that we never have to feel like these people would have felt. But it's hard to actually hear those stories.
Look at this street sign in an Apeldoorn suburb. If the name looks Canadian, it's because it is. A dozen streets in this neighborhood are named after one of the almost 8,000 Canadians who never came home from the battle. What was it about those young men who, through the generations, the Dutch won't stop thanking? Who were those guys?
George Beale was one of them, a major with the 48th Highlanders. Every few
Highlanders?
days he'd stop and write a letter home to his wife, Ruth, in Toronto. This is one of them. Here's what he said. My own darling, I haven't written you for 5 days. I didn't feel much like it, sweetie, as we were fighting again, and I was awfully busy, and we've been having a tough fight. At the moment, I'm sitting in a city called Apeldoorn, and the Queen's Palace is within 100 yards of me. That's the Queen's Palace, right over there. We're about 100 yards from it. He might have been right here. We entered the town proper this morning after a big advance from the Isle River. I'm fine, Ruth, so don't worry, although I'm very tired. The enemy's running like the devil again, and we have to chase him.
To hear that first-hand account of that soldier, now, like 70 years later, we just hear these words and we can appreciate their bravery, but imagine actually being in that situation, chasing soldiers down, fighting, shooting at each other, potentially having that your life taken away, and still writing a letter to your wife.
Fighting was bloody,
unbelievable,
and the dying. But through it all, George wrote to Ruth about the love he had for his men.
He wrote.
I wonder what the connection with if there's a connection with Scotland also. Being called the Highlanders, he was wearing a kilt, and I noticed some tartan on one of the hats as well. I wonder if that has any Scottish link or connection
This
also.
one on Sunday, April 22nd. I have fought and lived with those men for over a year, and to me they seemed as though they were part of my family. They never refused to go any place I ordered, and did everything I asked them to, cheerfully and willingly, knowing most of the time that I might be sending them to their deaths.
There were lots of individual Canadian heroes here, Army men like George Beale, but Air Force flyers too.
50 years ago, these fields near Nistelrode in southeastern Holland were home base for a Royal Canadian Air Force Spitfire squadron. One of those Canadian pilots was a 22-year-old chap from Lethbridge, Alberta.
22 years
His name
old.
was Richard Odette. Well, near the end of December 1944, Odette had flown more than 50 missions. But up until that point, he had scored no German kills. Well, on the 29th of December 1944, all that changed. When Richard Odette flew out of one of these fields, he flew right into the history books. Before he returned, he had shot down 5 German aircraft. No other Canadian pilot, no other British pilot had scored that many victories in one mission.
Whoa, now that is a true hero. That's someone who made their mark on the war. 5 kills. Is someone like that still celebrated in Canada? Is still taught about in schools in Canada and things as well? But yeah, I've got to give a huge appreciation to the Canadian military, these Canadian soldiers. Yeah, you can take them individually, but as a collective, you've just got to show huge appreciation. You know, I'm not even from this town in Netherlands. I'm not from the Netherlands, but even me being from the UK, I cannot appreciate the Canadian military anymore.
Meanwhile, frontline fighters broke through to capture key strategic locations. All this was happening as the Nazis were facing their final desperate days, until that last moment when the fighting and the dying suddenly stopped. 70 years ago this week, the war ended.
And here's what George Beale wrote to Ruth on that same day. You can feel the emotion in his voice. Darling, you couldn't possibly have any idea just what kind of a reception it has been and still is. The people go simply mad. And I had the honor, darling, of being the leading vehicle, my Jeep. Any town we went through, the people crowded the roads and we had a most difficult time getting past them. They all want to touch your hand or even kiss you, and they simply pelted us with flowers. My Jeep looked like a florist shop. It does make all the hardships worthwhile when you see the joy of these liberated people.
Yeah, that's it, man. The huge outpouring of relief from these normal people who have probably had family members, people they know. Probably every person in that town would have been touched by someone who had been taken to their death. Can you imagine how great? That's why they're so grateful, man. You see it there, like these men were treated like heroes at the time, and it's good to see they're still treated as heroes now.
For this year's returning heroes, new medals from the local mayor.
Your memories, your thoughts guide us as we shape our future.
And new thoughts about an old battle.
Well, I was stationed here during the war as a Canadian Women's Army Corps, which I'm very proud of, and it brings back so many memories. And I always have a place in my heart for Holland, for Apeldoorn.
It's a great, great day, you know. For the little thing we did, we get so much, 1,000 times more time.
The Dutch people are so
The Dutch people are the best people in the world.
He's been so humble as well, this little thing we did, which is absolutely huge to any normal person.
Wangeningen just down the road from Apeldoorn, in that little building. That's where the Germans finally surrendered. These extraordinary pictures capture the moment.
To the Commander-in-Chief, 21 Army Group. These forces to lay down their arms and to surrender unconditionally.
And there at the table, Canadian General George Kitching, distinguished then and just as distinguished when I chatted with him at the same table 50 years later.
How do you feel when you come back in this room?
It's almost as if they're ghosts, as if you are the German, the opposite side of the table people. It was full of people then. Any movement, it was a very quiet movement. And in spite of the fact that there were 30 Canadian reporters, they were quiet.
He does
The
seem like a
general
true
is
gentleman.
gone now, and so are many of the men who fought with him. But the ones who are left, the ones who still come, the ones the Dutch, young and old, still so adore, are here with their memories. The ones that hurt, the ones that leave them quiet, and the ones that somehow make them smile.
I've never felt that I sacrificed anything to be part of a liberating army.
There were so many Canadians who lost their lives here in the Netherlands. How did you handle that on a day-to-day basis?
I put it out of my mind altogether, but nonetheless I cry when I go to the cemetery and see my friends' graves.
I never learned to cry.
Joe?
You just feel it inside.
What does it mean to you guys to be remembered the way you are here in this country, the way they look at you, the way they react to you?
Well, it's 70 years ago that we were here, but still, the kids are still enthusiastic about what we did here 70 years ago, and I love to see kids the way they greet us and the way they look in such admiration at us, you know.
That's what I mentioned. Yeah, it's like interesting to see the younger generation still have that respect. I feel like that's something that's lost in a lot of countries, like the younger generation respecting military professionals. I mean, these guys, maybe they just don't appreciate what these men and women went through. Maybe they don't appreciate what the men and women of today's militaries go through. And it's quite sad they don't have that respect. But to see this town in Netherlands, the younger generation still have that, that makes me feel happy.
Really, it was something to feel the happiness, the joy of the liberation.
I asked the people I was staying with, what is this touching bit, you know? They asked permission to touch you, and I couldn't get over that, so they want to touch a liberator, and they want their children to touch a liberator.
20 years ago, I asked the then mayor of Apeldoorn why it was that the Dutch never forgot the Canadians. His answer was very simple, very direct. He said, you have to have been occupied to appreciate what freedom really means. And when you do, you never forget who gave it to you.
That's true.
That's why Canada is never forgotten here.
Wow.
Never.
That was just great. Again, a subject I knew nothing about at all, and I feel quite embarrassed that I never knew about that. But better late than never. Love to find out that story. Not just find out about the story of the liberation itself, but to find out how it's still celebrated today, how those brave men and women are still celebrated by this town in the Netherlands. To see that connection between these two countries, and just that respect, it just makes me, it's bittersweet in that it's a like terrible situation what actually happened to all those people who lost their lives in the Netherlands, but it makes me happy to see that respect and see that those people, their memory live on, not just the soldiers, the victims of that war. But tell me what you think about that. Tell me what, if you're from Canada, what you think about the connection with the Netherlands. How do you feel about today's Canadian military? Tell me in the comments. Thanks.